Hi, welcome to the Brandwood CKC June webinar, Let's Talk Clinical Evidence Reports, What You Need to Know. My name is Heyam Kalla and I'm a Senior Consultant at Brandwood CKC. Today I will cover some of the more important aspects of clinical evidence reports, which I hope you'll find beneficial. So firstly, I'd like to begin with what is a clinical evidence report. A clinical evidence report, or a clinical evaluation report, also known as a CER, is the assessment and analysis of clinical data pertaining to a medical device. A clinical evidence report is needed for devices of all classifications and consists of a combination of direct and indirect clinical data. This is usually a combination of data from clinical trials, clinical investigations, and published scientific papers, as well as post-market data from both publicly available sources and from the manufacturer. We'll talk about some of these aspects today. The main purpose of a CER, or a clinical evidence report, is to demonstrate a positive risk-benefit profile of the medical device. It supports the clinical safety and efficacy of the device and ultimately is used to demonstrate conformity with the relevant general safety and performance requirements in Europe, as well as the essential principles in Australia. So to provide a bit of additional context for this presentation, I wanted to give a bit of an overview of the jurisdictional requirements and guidance for the clinical evidence reports. In Europe, the needs and requirements for clinical evidence reports are dictated in the medical device regulations, known as the MDR. Now, this was due to come into effect in May of this year, but has recently been delayed as a result of the pandemic, and is now due to come into effect in May of 2021. It is important to note that in addition to the clinical evaluation report, the MDR also has a requirement around a clinical evaluation report plan to be outlined and followed. The latest revision of the clinical evidence report guidance document, known as the MEDEV 2.7/1 Rev 4, provides the detailed direction on the format and the content of this clinical evidence report. In Australia, the TGA has developed the Clinical Evidence Guidelines for Medical Devices. Again, these guidelines provide direction on what constitutes clinical evidence and the process of clinical data generation and the requirements of clinical evaluation to produce such clinical evidence. While there are some differences between Europe and Australia, they remain compatible such that a manufacturer is able to produce a single clinical evaluation report to cover both Australian and European regulations. Now, in the US, while a formalized clinical evidence report is not defined within the USA FDA requirements, the data is still valuable in demonstrating that the device is safe and efficacious for its intended purpose, which is a requirement of the FDA regulations. The content and purpose of the CER has relevance across all jurisdictions. So a clinical evaluation report includes requirements for evaluation and then analysis for both direct and indirect clinical data. So what is the difference between the two? When we refer to direct clinical data, this is pertaining to all the data that is available on the subject device, and so this includes clinical trials, post-market data, literature, as well as registry information. While when we talk about indirect clinical data, this is pertaining to a predicate or a similar marketed device for which the manufacturer seeks to establish a substantial equivalence. This is often utilized in the event where the direct data may be considered insufficient to support the device in demonstrating its clinical safety and performance. So in today's presentation, we are going to talk about 4 key aspects of a clinical evidence report, which I believe are the most important. Firstly, we will touch on clinical trials. So this includes direct studies on the medical device, and then talk about what sort of information should be included in the clinical evaluation report. We will then talk about equivalence. This is also known as the demonstration of equivalence, and we'll talk about some factors to consider when using this avenue in your clinical evidence report. We will then talk a bit about literature, what to think about when conducting a systematic literature search, as well as the types of sources to consider. Lastly, we will touch on post-market data, the types of data and the specific things to consider when presenting this information in your clinical evidence report. So firstly, clinical trials. So clinical trials, also known as clinical investigations and clinical studies, refer to the systematic investigation in human subjects undertaken to assess the safety and performance of the medical device. These types of studies provides one of the strongest sources of evidence to include in your clinical evidence report. They are highly regarded by all regulators and will be considered the most valuable piece of evidence in the CER. It is important to note that a clinical investigation should be planned and conducted where there are gaps in the data available for a medical device that cannot be addressed by other means. This means that if you do not have sufficient safety data and you cannot use literature or post-market data to prove this, then you may need to conduct a clinical investigation. So a detailed yet concise summary of the clinical trials conducted on the device should be included in the report. So what type of data should you include? Firstly, summarizing the purpose of the clinical trial, what was done and why, including the endpoints, so what were you trying to prove, discussing the population, so how many were enrolled, what gender were there, the type of cohort, the data that had been collected, the adverse events or incident that occurred during the duration of the trial. This one's particularly important as it should discuss, did those adverse events or incident impact the patient safety? Was it device related, etc.? Whether or not the results were statistically relevant. And importantly, the study or studies must be appraised and analyzed. It is important to bring this back to the safety and effectiveness of the device, which is the purpose of the clinical evaluation report. I wanted to mention two key aspects or two things to consider when thinking about clinical trials and your clinical evidence report. The first being that all clinical trials should be included in your clinical evaluation report. So this is past studies, studies that are still underway, as well as future studies. Now, the studies that are still underway, that interim status will be important for the regulator to make an assessment on the safety and effectiveness. The future studies are part of your post-market clinical follow-up. Now, this is another aspect of the MDR, however, it does feed back into your clinical evaluation report. The second aspect is that Class 3 and Class 2B implantable devices are actually mandated to have clinical investigations under the new MDR. There are a few exceptions, which is that the device has been designed by modifications of a device already marketed by the same manufacturer, and that the manufacturer is able to prove substantial equivalence, as well as the clinical evaluation of that marketed device is sufficient to demonstrate conformity of the modified device with the relevant safety and performance requirements. This basically means that you can use substantial equivalence, however, your equivalent device needs to have sufficient data to prove the safety and performance. Now, this leads us into our second item. So what is equivalence and when do we use it? When we talk about equivalence, we are specifically referring to evidence or data from a predicate or a similar marketed device that may be used to demonstrate the safety and performance of the subject device. This is needed when there isn't enough direct clinical data on the subject device. What is required is that the manufacturer demonstrates substantial equivalence to an identified similar device, and therefore we are able to present the data from that similar marketed device that is able to support the subject device in substantiating its safety and performance. This is often referred to as the demonstration of equivalence or the demonstration of substantial equivalence in the Australian and European regulations. It is noted that for the USA 510K, the concept of substantial equivalence is employed. However, this is quite different, and what is likely able to be used for the 510K process will not be acceptable for the European or Australian process. When it comes to demonstrating equivalence in the clinical evidence report, the similar device chosen must share the same intended purpose as the subject device. This is both a European and Australian requirement. To demonstrate equivalence, the clinical, technical, and biological characteristics must be identified and discussed in detail. It must address all characteristics within these three headings. This includes the similarities and the differences. The demonstration of equivalence should include an in-depth discussion on how any of the differences are not expected to significantly affect the clinical performance and the clinical safety of the device under evaluation. This is extremely important. If the assessor does not accept your justifications of those differences, they may not accept the equivalence at all. If this happens, then they will completely disregard the evidence provided on that equivalent device, which could greatly impact the success of your clinical evidence report. Remember, the purpose of the clinical evaluation report is to show that the device has a positive benefit to risk ratio. And if this is not able to be achieved with direct evidence, then if the equivalence is also rejected, then the requirement and the purpose of the clinical evidence report has not been met. So when demonstrating equivalence, what are a few considerations to look for? These are questions that I've been asked a lot, so I thought I would include them in today's session. Firstly, has each of the technical specifications been considered? Now, the technical specifications is one of the most important aspects of the equivalence table, as this is really getting into the nitty and gritty of how and why a device functions. Think about the material compositions, their geometries, coding specifications, power sources, fixation. It is very, very specific to the type of device. I would get your engineering and your product marketing team to help with this, as they usually know those types of details with the product. Secondly, what sort of characteristics are important? Like I mentioned before, it does differ for the type of devices. So a software device, an implantable cardiac pacemaker, custom devices, and joint replacements will have very different specifications to look at. It's really important to think about what makes sense for the device type. Thirdly, how many equivalent devices do I need? Now, if there are extremely similar devices on the market, you could only need one, and one is what I recommend, because remember that the equivalent device is what you will have to present all the data on. So if you have multiple, then you will need to present the data on all the equivalent devices. It's really important to note that if you have more than one device, you need to talk about each characteristic across all of those devices. So you cannot chop and change and say that this device is similar to my subject device in this way, but is different in this way. Yet this second equivalent device is the same in that way, but different in this way. The justification has to be across all the devices and across all the specifications. So the more equivalent devices, the more work you'll essentially have to do to prove that substantial equivalence. So who should be involved? I think this is a really important one because, like I mentioned before about the specifications, this is really a team effort. So getting your engineering team involved, getting your marketing team involved, as well as your regulatory and clinical, will allow you to provide a really solid equivalence table or a really solid substantial equivalence. They are able to provide different insights and contribute in ways that the regulatory team alone may not consider. I want to talk about literature reviews and literature. So literature reviews are used to identify data that is not held by the manufacturer. Traditionally, this has been considered to only involve published scientific literature, but it actually also includes post-market databases, such as the FDA MORE database, recall database, clinical trial and device registries. It encompasses all that data that is found from external sources. This is particularly highlighted in the MEDEV REPL guidance. So specifically in the MEDEV, it is stated that the literature is used to identify potential sources of data pertaining to the device under evaluation, which includes the subject device and/or equivalent devices, as well as it is used to establish the current state of the art. Now, it is noted that these two are actually two separate objectives and may require a separate literature protocol and plan to be conducted. The protocol and plan of a literature search is very important and must be clear in the CER or in the CER plan. Now, this slide provides a high-level flow diagram of a literature search. It's important that each of these components is actually outlined in the plan prior to commencement. So firstly, the databases that are searched. Identification of these is really important. Secondly, search terms. Making sure this covers your devices and/or your state-of-the-art parameters. It should be inclusive and comprehensive. Additionally, adding any search filters, whether or not you restricted it to randomized controlled trials or the last 10 years, should be clearly identified. It is also important to include the date of the search and who actually conducted the literature search. Your inclusion criteria. So being very clear as to the inclusion parameters of the articles, as well as your exclusion criteria. Now, it's important that this is clear for each article. So if you have 100 articles to go through and you only end up with 20, it's important that this is very clear for the assessor as to how you got to that 20 and whether or not the exclusion or the inclusion criteria applied, or if there is another reason. Now, once all the data has been collected and identified, so once you have the papers that you are going to include, a critical appraisal is also needed, which I'll talk a little bit more next. So what is critical appraisal? Critical appraisal is used to determine the value and the quality of the data or paper. It's basically determining the strength of that paper or study, and you determine whether or not it should be included in your clinical evidence report. It is also referred to as the weighting of evidence. It incorporates the assessment of the methodology that the researchers or writers took and the type of study that was performed. Now, determining whether the results were valid could be based on whether or not the researchers actually followed their own methods. Were there any other limitations to the study, such as a small sample size or a heterogeneous population? Was the methodology used valid to answer the actual research question or the objective of that paper or study? Is the patient population appropriate to your objective of your literature search? So if the study was referring to patients of a certain age group, but your device is used on another age group, are you still able to use those results? And lastly, was there any bias? Now, it is perfectly okay to include a manufacturer-sponsored study, but it should just be clear. The key thing is to not hide anything. So if there are papers that are unpublished or papers that are included as manufacturer-sponsored study, this should definitely be included. It just should be made clear that there is that link. Now, each included paper from the previous step needs to be critically appraised, and luckily there are tools to help in this process. So there are quite a few critical appraisal tools out there to help assess with your literature as part of your clinical evidence report. Some tools are much more comprehensive than others. So there are some that are a checklist, some that are a questionnaire. There are also tools that are for different types of studies. So certain tools may work only on a randomized controlled trial, whereas others may be all-encompassing. Now, it's important to think about the correct tool for your clinical evidence report, or whether or not you will use a different type of tool. This comes down to how your literature search will be conducted, the objective, and the type of papers that you will get returned. Systematic reviews and meta-analyses, as well as randomized controlled trials, are generally considered the highest level of evidence for research. However, it's often difficult to find these types of studies for medical devices. So it's important to always justify and to think about what works best for your literature search. Now, most importantly, the literature review and protocol needs to be planned, conducted, and described in sufficient detail for the regulator to be able to repeat the exercise. It needs to be clear, justified, and reproducible. The biggest emphasis on any literature search comes down to these 3 points. It needs to be clear enough that someone is able to follow it. It needs to be justified. Remember to justify everything, as well as reproducible, as some assessors may actually choose to reproduce the search, so they will expect to get the same outcomes that you did. Make it really easy and easy to follow. Be transparent and justify. I cannot stress this enough. Justify all the actions you take. And if you had any deviations to the original protocol plan, make sure you include this. The key thing is to not hide anything, and that's why I really stress the justification point. Justify, justify, justify. And remember the critical appraisal, of course. So our last key aspect, we'll talk about post-market data. So post-market data can be a combination of the in-house data, which is basically everything that's held by the manufacturer. So adverse events, complaints, as well as recalls and corrective actions. It can also include data from external sources, so registries, publicly available adverse event databases, recall databases, and clinical trial databases. It's important to take all this data into account, to present it and to analyze it in your CER. Look at all the pieces and present them and analyze them, and bring that back to your risk assessment as well. There is heaps of emphasis on the post-market side in the MDR. That's probably one of the key changes compared to the MDD. So it's really important that this is incorporated into your clinical evidence. So what are some things that you should consider when looking at your post-market data? Firstly, your regulatory actions. So any regulatory actions that have been taken on the subject device should be discussed in detail. This includes recalls, corrective actions. It's really important to not avoid discussing something. Secondly, include all the incidents. This includes complaints and your adverse events. These should be clearly tabulated with adverse events, especially those that are serious, discussed in detail. This includes discussion on whether or not they are device related. Include as much detail as possible. So the types of events that occurred, the geographical locations, and whether or not there was a patient impact. Thirdly, if there are any rates or a trend that's identified or obvious within the data, make sure you disclose this, discuss it. It's better to be upfront and discuss the trend than just avoid it altogether, especially if it's actually clear within the data. And lastly, risk assessment. So make sure that the post-market data information or the data that you're getting from your post-market is actually incorporated back into your risk assessment. It's really important to show this relationship, as that's one of the key aspects of the MDR as well as the Australian regulations. One last thing, all the data in the clinical evidence report needs to be analysed and evaluated. This is probably one of the absolute most important points. It is not sufficient to simply present the data in your clinical evidence. Just include your adverse events or your clinical trial data or your literature data. The key thing is to discuss and analyze and evaluate that data. What is the data saying about the performance and safety or the risk-benefit profile? Always bring that back to the purpose of this clinical evidence report. This is absolute key. Thank you to those of you who have sent in questions. I think I've covered many throughout my presentation today. However, I wanted to complete today's webinar answering a few of those. So question number 1, how often are CERs required to be updated? The key thing here is that a clinical evidence report is an active and evolving document. According to the MEDEV, it should be updated if the manufacturer receives any new information from their post-market surveillance. If this has the potential to change the current evaluation, it should be immediately updated. If no such information has been received from the PMS, then the CER should be updated at least annually for a device that carries significant risks, or a device that is not yet well established, or every 2 to 5 years if the device is not expected to carry significant risks and is well established. However, a justification should be provided. I guess the key thing here is that, it is an evolving document. So if there is new information coming in, then the clinical evidence report should be updated. If not, then at least annually. If you're able to justify that the clinical evidence report is able to be updated every 2 to 5 years, then then you're able to do that. Question number 2, how to overcome the European Generic System Clinical Evidence Report when Australia expects data on specific Class 3 UPI entries. So a UPI is a unique product identifier for those who don't know. You were able to utilise a system clinical evidence report for the Australian market. I haven't come across this problem before. I would suggest though that if it's not clear which devices are included in that clinical evidence report, that it is made clear. I mean, if you think about a knee system, this is a system that includes multiple UPIs according to the Australian regulations. It is definitely doable. I would just, like I said, just make it clear that, this is the system, yet these are the devices that the CER covers. Question number 3, Do you have any advice on how companies should record and store data/results when conducting clinical trials for their medical device registration? I guess with all clinical trials, we highly recommend that you follow the good clinical practice. There are guidance and standards out there which are really helpful. One of them is, the ISO 14155 standard. This provides information on recording of the data, the electronic data systems, record retention. They're really useful and they're really vital for, providing information on the data on how to store that data to be then used in your clinical evidence report. Question number 4. What is the impact of the MDR? What additional requirements are there compared to the MDD? The MDR brings about a few changes. I guess the increased scrutiny. There is a massive emphasis on planning. I mean, now we have, the CER plan, post-market clinical follow-up plan, a PMS plan. There is much more emphasis on that. Another major change is the emphasis on post-market data in particular. So there's the introduction of the UTMED, there's the requirement to supply post-market data on a yearly basis to your notified body. The requirement that direct clinical data is needed for high-risk devices. So, ultimately the goal is the same. It's all about meeting that safety, the essential requirements, which is now the general safety performance requirements. So that, the essentialness of it hasn't changed. There are just a few more kind of avenues to demonstrate that now. Question number 5 is this clinical evaluation for the eyes of the US FDA? I mentioned this earlier. There is not a specific requirement for, a clinical evidence report in the traditional sense for the US FDA. But the components of the clinical evidence report is definitely useful or can be used, as part of that FDA process. Question number 6. There were a few questions on this about whether or not the classification of devices need a lower risk of classification need clinical evidence report. There was particularly concern around, class 1s being updated to or up classified to a class 2A, particularly around the software. The key thing is that the requirement for a CER does not change. So a class 1 device still needs a clinical evidence report. So that, that should exist. If it has if it has increased its classification, it's increasing its risk. Therefore, there may be further information needed to help prove that essential the essential requirements. But essentially, all medical devices, regardless of classification, need a clinical evidence report. And if a device is being upclassed, maybe consider if the evidence is enough. But essentially, the clinical evidence report is to support or, to demonstrate conformity with those essential requirements, the safety and performance of the device. So whether or not it's a class 1 or a class 3, there should be a clinical evidence report and it should be able to demonstrate and prove that safety and performance. So that's it. Thank you for listening in today. I hope you found this presentation informative. Please get in touch if you have any additional questions or if you need any further assistance or if anything wasn't clear. Always glad to help. Thanks.